It's very difficult to talk about even a short book in such a short span of time, but I'm going to do my best so that you have a glimpse of what the book is about. The object of my book is to analyze the evolution of developing countries in the world economy situated in a long-term historical perspective, from the onset of the second millennium, but with a focus on the second half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st. It is perhaps among the first to address this theme on such a wide canvas that spans both time and space. This is a big picture book, which sketches with bold strokes on a wide canvas, and it is not about joining the little dots. In the book, developing countries or the developing world are defined as Africa, Asia excluding Japan, and Latin America including the Caribbean. The first part of the book sets the stage. It examines their decline and fall during the period from 1820 to 1950. The second part is the primary focus. It analyzes the extent and nature of catch-up during the period from 1950 to 2010. The third part contemplates the future of developing countries in the world economy. Now, in the span of world history, the distinction between industrialized and developing countries, or rich and poor nations, is relatively recent. It surfaced in the last quarter of the 19th century. In fact, 1,000 years ago, Asia, Africa, and South America, it was not Latin then, taken together accounted for more than 80% of world population and world income. This was attributable in large part to Asia, where just two countries, China and India, accounted for approximately 50% of world population and world income. The overwhelming significance of these three continents in the world economy continued for another 5 centuries, until circa 1500. The beginnings of change are discernible from the early 16th century to the late 18th century. The voyages of discovery and the colonization of the Americas were critical turning points, as the consequent mercantile expansion of trade, supported by state power and naval power, combined with social, political, and institutional change in Europe, created the initial conditions for capitalist development. Even so, in the mid-18th century, circa 1750, the similarities between Europe and Asia were far more significant than the differences. Indeed, demography, technology, and institutions were broadly comparable. The Industrial Revolution in Britain during the late 18th century, which spread to Europe over the next 50 years, exercised a profound influence on the shape of things to come. Yet, in 1820, less than 200 years ago, Asia, Africa, and South America still accounted for 3/4 of world population and about 2/3 of world income. The share of China and India taken together was 50%, even in 1820. The dramatic transformation of the world economy began around 1820. Slowly but surely, the geographical divides in the world turned into economic divides. The divide rapidly became a chasm. The economic significance of Asia, Africa, and Latin America witnessed a precipitous decline, such that by 1950, there was a pronounced asymmetry between their share of world population at 2/3 and their share of world income at 1/4. In sharp contrast, between 1820 and 1950, Europe, North America, and Japan increased their share in world population from 1/4 to 1/3, and in world income from more than 1/3 to almost 3/4. The rise of the West was concentrated in Western Europe until 1870 and North America, the United States, thereafter. The decline and fall of the rest was concentrated in Asia, much of it attributable to China and India, while Latin America was the exception, as its shares in world population and world income were not only symmetrical throughout, but also rose over time. The great divergence in per capita incomes was nevertheless the reality. In a short span of 130 years, 1820 to 1950, as a percentage of GDP in Western Europe and what Madison calls Western offshoots, but essentially North America, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, mostly the US, GDP per capita in Latin America dropped from 60% to 40%, in Africa from 35% to 15%, and in Asia from 50% to 10% of levels in Western Europe and North America. But that was not all. Between 1830 and 1913, the share of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in world manufacturing production, attributable mostly to Asia, in particular China and India, collapsed from 60% to 7.5%, while the share of Europe, North America, and Japan rose from 40% to 92%. To stay at these levels until 1950. The industrialization of Europe and the deindustrialization of Asia during the 19th century were two sides of the same coin. It led to what I reproduced from Dennis Robertson, the great specialization, which meant that Western Europe, followed by the United States, specialized in and exported manufactured goods, while Asia, Africa, and Latin America specialized in and exported primary commodities. The century from 1850 to 1950 witnessed a progressive integration of these three continents into the world economy through international trade, international investment, and international migration, which created and embedded a division of labor between countries that was most unequal in its consequences for development. The outcome was the decline and fall of Asia, a retrogression of Africa, although Latin America fared much better in its post-colonial era, which began 200 years ago, except for the divergence in incomes. So that by 1950, the divide between rich industrialized countries and poor underdeveloped countries was enormous. Now, during the 6 decades from 1950 to 2010, changes in the share of developing countries in world output and levels of per capita income relative to industrialized countries provide a sharp contrast. In terms of Madison PPP statistics, the share of developing countries in world output stopped its continuous decline circa 1960, when it was about 1/4, to increase rapidly after 1980, so that by 2008 it was almost 1/2. While the divergence in GDP per capita also came to a stop in 1980 and was followed by a modest convergence thereafter, so that as a proportion of GDP per capita in industrialized countries, it was about 1/5 in 2008. In current prices and at market exchange rates, however, which is the more appropriate comparison, between 1970 and 2010, the share of developing countries in world GDP doubled from 1/6 to 1/3, while their GDP per capita as a proportion of that in industrialized countries recorded a modest increase from about little less than 7% to about 10%. So that difference was still huge. Now, differences in GDP growth rate underlie the rising share of developing countries and the falling share of industrialized countries in world GDP. Now, during the period 1951-80, GDP growth rates in developing countries were somewhat higher than in developing countries. Now, this was impressive because these decades coincided with the golden age of capitalism in the industrialized world, when it witnessed unprecedented economic growth. For developing countries, of course, such growth rates were a dramatic contrast with their performance in the preceding 100 years, and also much higher than growth rates in industrialized countries at comparable stages of development. Now, during the period 1981 to 2008, GDP growth rates in developing countries were almost double those in industrialized countries. And while until 1980, per capita income growth was lower, much lower, because population growth rates were higher, as population growth rates slowed down in the period from 1980 to 2008, per capita income growth in developing countries was also significantly higher than in industrialized countries. Now, the engagement of developing countries with the world economy witnessed a decline during the period 1950 to 1980 when compared with the past, and the reasons for that are discussed in the book, but revived circa 1980 and grew rapidly thereafter. However, this deeper engagement was now a matter of choice, in sharp contrast with the compulsion of the past. Their share in world merchandise trade, exports and imports more than doubled, from less than 20% in 1970 to more than 40% in 2010. Similarly, their share of outward and inward direct foreign investment in the world economy, although they were more important as countries of destination than of origin. The movement of people from developing to industrialized countries emerged as a significant form of engagement despite draconian immigration laws and restrictive consular practices, with new forms of labor mobility, guest workers, illegal immigrants, and professional persons driven by markets and globalization. Now, such international migration exercised a profound influence on the world economy. It was an important factor underlying productivity increase and economic dynamism in the industrialized world, while remittances from migrants were an important source of external finance in developing countries that eased constraints on growth, although the brain drain was an obvious negative consequence, but return migration could transform this into a brain gain. Now, it is clear that during the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st, there was a substantial catch-up on the part of developing countries in the aggregate. Some comparisons of their relative importance in the world economy at present with the past are instructive, and that is why I use Madison statistics. In 2008, the share of developing countries in world GDP was close to their share in 1850, while their GDP per capita as a proportion of that in industrialized countries was the same as it had been in 1900. The share of developing countries in world trade, even in 1970, was the same as it in 1913, and their share in foreign investment about the same at the turn of both 19th and 20th centuries, end of. Now, the share of developing countries in world industrial production remained at its 1913 level, 7.5%, until 1970. But in 2010, at more than 40%, it was higher than it had been in 1860 and close to what it was in 1850. On the whole, it is plausible to suggest, which I do in the book, that the significance of developing countries in the world economy circa 2010 is about the same as it was in 1870, or a little earlier. Now, this is an outcome of catch-up since 1950, and it makes it plausible to suggest that the significance of developing countries in the world economy circa 2030 would be roughly what it was in 1820. I speculate a little, but I think it's likely. Now, it is clear that there was a significant catch-up in industrialization for the developing world as a whole, beginning around 1950, that gathered momentum in the 1970s. There were structural changes in the composition of output and employment. The share of developing countries in world industrial production jumped from 8% to 33% in constant prices and about 12% to 40% in current prices. Their share in world of exports of manufactures rose from about 8% to 40%. And industrialization also led to pronounced changes in the composition of their trade. But this industrialization was most uneven between regions. Asia led the process in terms of structural change, share in industrial production, rising manufactured exports, and changing patterns of trade, while Latin America witnessed relatively little change and Africa made almost no progress. The observed outcome in terms of industrial production was attributable in important part to development strategies and economic policies in the post-colonial era that created the initial conditions and laid the essential foundations in countries that were latecomers to industrialization. The import substitution-led strategies of industrialization, much maligned by orthodoxy, that was concerned with comparative statics rather than economic dynamics, performed a critical role in this process of catch-up. Of course, a complete explanation is far more complex, as it needs to recognize specificities and nuances. All the same, it is clear that the role of the state in evolving policies, developing institutions, and making strategic interventions, whether as a catalyst or a leader, was also central to this process. Thus, I argue that industrialization was not so much about getting prices right as it was about getting state intervention right. Indeed, it is plausible to suggest that for a time it might even have been about getting prices wrong. State intervention in the form of industrial policy should recognize and exploit comparative advantage, but it is just as plausible to argue that instead of climbing the ladder step by step, it may be rewarding to jump sub steps in defiance of what comparative advantage may be at that time. In either case, state intervention is critical. Now, apart from an extensive role for governments, the use of borrowed technologies, an intense process of learning, the creation of managerial capabilities in individuals and technological capabilities in firms, the nurturing of entrepreneurs in different forms of enterprises, were important factors underlying this catch-up in industrialization. Now, the creation of initial conditions was followed by a period of learning to industrialize so that outcomes in industrialization surfaced with a time lag. And this accounts for the acceleration in growth of manufacturing output visible in the early 70s. And I argue it was not the magic of markets that produced this spurt in industrialization. It came from foundations that were laid in the preceding quarter century that are much decried by orthodoxy. Now note that much the same can be said about the now industrialized countries, as Hajun Chang argues, where industrial protection and state intervention was just as important at earlier stages of their development, as I sketch the picture about Britain in the book. Now, the distribution of catch-up in industrialization and development was uneven not only among regions, but also between countries within regions. There was a high degree of concentration among a few. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico in Latin America, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Turkey in Asia, and Egypt and South Africa. Egypt is a question mark in Africa. Now, the economic significance of these countries, which I describe as the next 14, in the developing world was overwhelming in terms of their size, reflected in GDP and population, their engagement with the world economy, reflected in trade, investment, and migration, and in industrialization, reflected in manufactured exports and industrial production. Now, the determinants of such concentration are size, growth, and history. But there was also enormous diversity within these few. But the 8 Asian countries among them saw the end of divergence and beginnings of convergence. The 4 Latin American countries stayed roughly where they were. the two African countries continued to experience a divergence. Now, there were differences between the next 14 in settings, drivers, emphases, transitions, and models, but they had three things in common that put them on the path to sustained industrialization. Initial conditions, enabling institutions, and the role of governments as catalysts or leaders in the process. And I argue that many of the laggards in industrialization now may not be very different from what these leaders in industrialization were 50 years ago. Indeed, there is much they can learn from the experience of the next 14 in creating initial conditions, establishing institutions, and supporting, nurturing supportive governments. Now, these efforts will, of course, have to be contextualized. Now, in the catch-up process, there are two essential challenges for late industrializers, leaders and followers alike. It is necessary to create control mechanisms embodied in institutions that impose discipline on the economic behavior not only of individuals and firms, but also of governments. And it is necessary to develop technological capabilities in firms and in the economy which can advance the technology frontier in at least a few industries or sectors. Now, I will, Chair, wind up in 2 minutes, so I don't exceed my 25, but I will focus, therefore, on the past and the present rather than on the future, and that could come up in discussion. Now, the era of catch-up, please note, I want to emphasize this, from 1950 to 2010 has been associated with emerging divergences in the world economy. First, international inequality between countries and among people remains at high levels. Inequality between countries diminished slowly, if modestly, but if China and India are excluded, it increased rapidly, even after 1980. And if China and India are treated not as countries, but each province is treated as a country, that inequality also increased enormously. Much of this was attributable to inequality between rich and poor countries, although there was some increase in inequality within the latter group. Inequality among people in the world, which increased sharply during the period from 1820 to 1950 as a consequence of the Great Divergence, persisted at somewhat higher levels through the second half of the 20th century. Second, the process of catch-up was associated with an exclusion of countries and regions within countries in the developing world from the process of development. There was a massive divergence in per capita incomes between the least developed countries, 48 of them, and the rest of the developing world, while there was a significant convergence in per capita incomes for the next 14 with the rest of the developing world. But even in the next 14, there was an exclusion of regions from this process of catch-up. Third, rapid economic growth in the developing world, underlying the catch-up in terms of aggregate income, was not always transformed into meaningful development, which improved the well-being of ordinary people. During the period from 1981 to 2008, the proportion of the population below the specified international poverty lines, say $1.25 PPP and $2 PPP per day, declined steadily, more for the lower than for the higher poverty line, but these proportions remain significant. Moreover, the absolute number of people below both poverty lines remains large, while the number of people between the two poverty lines who are vulnerable doubled over this period. The number of poor people, contrary to popular perception in 2010, is large not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia. In fact, half the world's poor still live in China and India. Despite the rapid economic growth, despite the rising share of world income, and the catch-up in industrialization. This is essentially because inequality between people has either been high or been rising in these countries, particularly in the next 14 that have led the catch-up process. Indeed, a disproportionately large part of increments in income may have accrued to the super-rich or the ultra-rich in the population. When I began, I had intended to conclude with some thoughts that contemplated the future, but I'm going to stop now so that there is time for us to engage in a discussion, and I can return to my sense of the future if people wish me to.
Deepak, thank you. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions that will push you on that future story.